Okay. All right, so people are logging in, and I think you can hear me. I'm using my microphone on my computer, and I apologize for the lateness. Again, these technical issues on the computer overwhelm me, so we're using now our own account separate from the university classroom computer. So let me go to attendance and log in here and log into European politics and go to attendance and click we are in week 3. Yes, indeed. So smart attendance, and make sure that you can all see this. So we're going to share screen, start smart attendance, and so you can see the screen, and your smart attendance number is 871. 871 is your smart attendance number. And so let me go to the chat and type in 871 here. And of course it's 871 like this. I want to let me, oh, I'm typing in the wrong 871. And there's your smart attendance number. Okay, so let's now continue. Today is our 2-hour class, and I have to make sure that we finish early enough that I can get out of here. So the next class, we'll be able to get set up. So I have to stop the Zoom at 11:30. So I have to keep that in mind. 10:30. Sorry, 10:30. And all right. So today is a really exciting time, obviously, in international relations and European politics. And so here's, let me open up my my lesson plan for today, and again, share the screen so that you can see the screen. And here is my lesson plan, which you all should be able to see. Everybody sees that on their computer? Good. Okay. So also your paragraphs were due, so we should have time for debate today. To South Koreans, Brexit shows that Europeanization is overrated. And let's make sure that we open up the notes for the chapter, because there's so much to cover these days because of the crisis in Ukraine most recently. And obviously, you know, since we're talking about war in Europe, great power war in Europe between the United States and Russia, and the danger of a nuclear escalation, it's very difficult not to talk about those issues when we're here in a class in European politics and society, right? And so, but at the same time, we want to cover the information that's in the chapter reading for this week, and we began to discuss that. But how can we connect what you've been reading this week with the events going on today? And that is a big challenge, but a challenge that we will meet, because I want to be up here in the front of the classroom. And the challenge that we can make is that one major theme in the book, in the textbook, is the formal official beginning of what we now call the European Union. And the official beginning of what we now call the European Union, what was the big international agreement or treaty, just to see if you recall, that launched the European Union as an official name for the European organization we call the European Union today? That's established the European Coal and Steel Community, which was the beginning of European integration. And do you remember the year that was? 1940. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, yeah, so it was in 1952 with the European Coal and Steel Community. And the European Coal and Steel Community is also named after, all of these treaties are often referred to in terms of the city where they were signed. And so the Treaty of Paris was signed where? Yay, Paris! And the treaty that officially launched the European Union was signed in a semi-small, medium-sized Dutch city called Maastricht in Holland. And that's typically referred to as the Treaty of Maastricht. The Treaty of Maastricht established officially launched or renamed the European community as the European Union. And so that's a theme throughout the book, that launching of the European Union also happened at a critical time in the development of international relations. The Treaty of Maastricht was signed, I believe, in 1992 and came into effect in 1993. So it was signed in Maastricht by the leaders of the heads of government and state in 1992. And then those formal legal treaty obligations, they have a period of time by which they have to be signed, and then they come into effect in 1993. So what happened at the end of 1991 that was not coincidentally also important for understanding why the leaders of what is today the European Union decided, were able to, and chose to take advantage of current international relations 30 years ago that pushed them to launch formally the European Union. I know this is long before you were born, but what was, from what you know from history, what was going on in 1991? Yeah, the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, right. The Soviet Union was disintegrating. There had been you should get another piece of chocolate if you want as a reward. There was instability in the Soviet Union. In August 1991, there was an attempted coup by conservative communist bureaucrats to overthrow Mikhail Gorbachev. The coup was foiled, was stopped by Boris Yeltsin, who was president of the Russian Republic at that time, and he rallied the Russian liberal constituencies, pro-democratic constituencies, also Russian nationalist constituencies to overcome the coup against Mikhail Gorbachev by conservative communist bureaucrats that saw Gorbachev as weakening and threatening the existence of the Soviet Union through his reforms. And the result was that they made the disintegration of the Soviet Union, these bureaucrats, even more likely because the fear and anger that their coup attempt generated and the mobilization of Russian public opinion and also other public opinion among the other nations of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics became even more intense as in reaction to the failed coup attempt in August 1991. So Boris Yeltsin and the leader of Belarus, very much in the news these days, Belarus, and the leader of Ukraine, the republic, 3 of the 15 republics in the Soviet Union got together and they decided that they were going to radically revise the constitution of the Soviet Union and basically agreed that they're going to dissolve the Soviet Union. And the leader of the Belarus was a man who is no longer living in Belarus. He lives in Washington because he had to flee for his life after Lukashenko became dictator 25 years ago. And the leader of Ukraine, I think at the time, was Leonid Kuchma, and the president of Russia. And this was Boris Yeltsin. And also, what else was going on in 1991 about this time, at the end of 1991 and into 1992? I know, again, this is 10 years before you were born, but do you know what else was going on? I recall from your history lessons, lots of things were going on, right? Not only with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and therefore with the end of the Cold War, not coincidentally also we're having the breakup of Yugoslavia in a violent civil war. among the different national republics at the same time. And also Saddam Hussein, dictator of Iraq, decides he's going to try to be the Otto von Bismarck of the Arabs and unify the Arabs through fighting a war against the hated, by annexing Kuwait, and after fighting a war against the hated Persians that he started in 1980 and ended in 1989, he then thought that with the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War and the long support of the Americans and Russians and others for him against Iran in that war that he started against the traditionally disliked Persians among Arab nationalist public opinion, he had a dispute with Kuwait, and he thought that he had America's support to be America's main ally in the Middle East, and decided that he would then use that diplomatic leverage to begin the process of unifying the Arab states that were divided and created and divided by the British and the French under his own dictatorship, sort of like recreating what Otto von Bismarck did with the Germans in 1870s. And of course he was wrong, but the point was there was a tremendous amount of activity going on in international relations at this time, tremendous amount of change. The end of the Cold War, which, you know, in my life had dominated my time from the time that I became politically aware until I started graduate school in 1985. And I finished my dissertation at the end of 1991 as well. I wrote a dissertation on Polish politics and Polish political reforms with the end of communism. So for the first 30 years of my life, the Cold War was dominating my thinking and the thinking of most people analyzing European integration and European affairs at the time. And the European Union attempted to respond to the challenge of the revolutions going on, the revolutionary changes going on in international relations and European affairs, and just international relations globally, like I mentioned, the first Persian Gulf War. And that they thought they would rise to the response by accelerating European integration. And not coincidentally, the Treaty of Maastricht was negotiated, or the Treaty on European Union, as it's also called, was negotiated at the time when Yugoslavia was disintegrating. Europe appeared to be unable to prevent a war in the heart of Europe, in Yugoslavia. Some of you know your geography, right? You know your geography. So you know that Yugoslavia is really very much part of Europe. If I can call up a map of the world while I go to Wikipedia here, and just to call up a map of Europe, so we have something to look at when I'm talking about Yugoslavia. And the European Union, rightly or wrongly, probably just as much wrongly as validly, has been criticized for preventing this country within Europe from breaking up in a violent civil war. Remember, the European Union claims that it exists in order to promote peace in Europe after 2 world wars. And here we have, at the end of the Cold War, a war breaking out in the middle of Europe, here in this country, a country that had experienced tremendous bloodshed in World War I and World War II. A country that, even though it was not part of what was the European community from until 1992, still was very much economically integrated into Europe, in the sense that there was much economic contact between these peoples living in Yugoslavia and the rest of Europe. And I think this is a little more accurate. See if we can find yeah, here is the constitutional republics of the Socialist Federated Republic of Yugoslavia, as it was called under the communist regime that came to power after 1992. And these people, Slovenia and Croatia, they had more sympathy among Catholic Italians and Germans. Serbians traditionally have more sympathy with the Russians, both in World War I and then in World War II, when the Soviet Union was the name of what was the government in Moscow at the time. And of course, the hope was that this was supposed to bring peace to these peoples, because these peoples had a history of violent conflict amongst themselves. Violent conflict instigated and inspired and supported by outside actors, the Germans, the Italians, different groups allying with these small groups who are seeking allies from outside, whether it be in Paris or Moscow or Berlin or elsewhere. And from 1945 until 1992, this region, despite this tremendous violence during World War II and earlier in World War I, it had been at peace through a communist dictatorship that was pretty mild. It wasn't like the kind of communist dictatorship under Joseph Stalin by the late 1940s. It was becoming a pretty mild communist dictatorship, but there was limits to what you could say there, and people knew there were limits to what you could say under Tito. And then Tito dies, the Yugoslav dictator, Josip Broz Tito dies in 1980, and this country slowly disintegrates. And then again, the Cold War begins to end more broadly across the world, and the intensity of concern of Germany and the European community in the United States for this part of the world that had been very much a strong focus of international concern and attention during the Cold War, because it was officially a communist country that was opposed or independent from control from Moscow. That it declared itself beginning in 1948. Tito and Stalin got into conflict with each other, and Tito declared his country to be neutral and not part of the Soviet alliance, not part of the Soviet pact. And so the Western countries, including the United States, poured lots of money and aid into this country during the Cold War in order to encourage it to remain autonomous or independent from control from Moscow. So there had been a lot of money put directly into this country. This is a beautiful coastline here along the Adriatic Sea. So this was a beautiful, cheap place to go on vacation. Europeans used to love, they still love to go to this area for vacation. I was there most recently, 5 years ago, for a conference on the Adriatic coast. And of course, the European integration begins, as you mentioned, with the Treaty of Paris. And then in 1957, they make another major step forward in European integration to create officially the European Economic Communities. And that was signed in 1957 in Rome. Hence, that's called the Treaty of Rome. And then European integration slowed down quite a bit. And then it did finally expand in 1973 when 3 new countries joined, the original 6 countries that created the European Coal and Steel Community. Anybody know the name of those 3 countries? The name of those 3 countries that joined in 1973? Hint, hint, hint. One of them just left the European Union.
And then I know one. It's just Britain.
Right, United Kingdom, and Ireland and Denmark joined because the United Kingdom joined. Ireland's economy was very much dependent upon the British economy, and the same was true with Denmark. And Denmark also had an unpleasant history with Germany during World War II. So the Danish state tended to be closely allied with Britain out of economic need and also political concern. And so this happened, of course, after the president of France, the great national leader, Charles de Gaulle, who had been president of France for many years, finally resigned in 1969, I think 68 or 69, and died in 1970. And he had always been saying to the British, no, 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 you may not join, because the British applied to join the European community way back in the early 1960s. And Charles de Gaulle said, these British, they're, in my view, not sufficiently really committed to the European project. That the British are more closely allied with the United States. They're part of more the Anglo-Saxon world, and their orientation is more to Washington than to Europe. And of course, given what happened in 2016, 6 years ago, maybe he was right. So the this is the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union and the United States are locked in intense competition for influence around the world from the late 1940s until at least 1989, right? But the Cold War became less and less intense particularly after Joseph Stalin died in 1953, and there was a ceasefire finally in the Korean War, which continues to the present, which is why we're all here today, right now. And after Stalin dies, there are crises, there are conflicts, but the intensity of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union slowly declines in its intensity. Mistakes and tragedies and catastrophes would still occur, but the improving or less intense conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States allowed more opportunity for this country to be economically connected and intertwined and interdependent with both the communist world and the capitalist world. So even though the United States and other actors like the World Bank were investing money in developing the infrastructure here, this country also had close economic ties with the communist countries next door, and close communist economic ties with the communist states next door. And so to fast forward, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in the Soviet Union in 1985 and is committed to trying to carry out far-reaching reforms in the Soviet Union because of the economic crisis in the Soviet Union, the terrible developing economic crisis that basically was causing the Soviet Union to completely stagnate economically. It wasn't growing anymore. And as the Western world became convinced that Mikhail Gorbachev, the general secretary of the Communist Party, was really serious about carrying out reforms, we saw also that the pace of integration among the European countries in the European community also began to accelerate. And again, that's a theme in the European Union literature, that the European Union has always been strongly influenced by the more surrounding broader international political environment, the Cold War, the disintegration of the Cold War. And you're seeing it now today in 2022, as we have a conflict now, an intensifying conflict between Russia and other European and the United countries and the United States, that again, it's going to have a big impact on the direction and the development of what the meaning of Europeanization is. Like, for example, I already mentioned more than once, your textbook was published 2 years ago. There's not much discussion at all. I don't think there's any discussion about military integration, military and security affairs. That's becoming a big issue right now. The Germans are increasing their military expenditures by 100 billion euros. They've declared they're developing the European Union military infrastructure to purchase and manufacture and purchase weapons to supply Ukraine. This is all, again, a reflection of the growing intensity of the conflict between Moscow and the West. So again, we see how European integration has been, again, its direction, its forms, its emphases is influenced by a number of factors, domestic, but also international. And so to go back to the notes for the reading and make sure that you're able to screen share and see that The Cold War disintegration ending reduced for many people the view that we need to integrate Europe for the national security of the allies of the United States. The United States is allied with European Union countries for the most part, not all, but most of the NATO countries belong in the European Union. I think 21 of the member states of the European Union out of the 27, 21 of them are NATO members. So Cyprus is not, I believe, a NATO member. Malta is not a NATO member. Ireland is not a NATO member. Sweden is not a NATO member. But almost all of them are. And this effort to move forward more quickly with deeper European integration through the Treaty of Maastricht was a response by the leaders of the European Union to what they saw as the challenge of keeping Europe together, integrated, and moving forward without an overarching big enemy like the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is gone. So, but for 40 years, from the late 1940s into the late 1980s, this concern or fear about the Soviet Union was one strong incentive for French, and one, it was just one. But it was a strong incentive for French and Germans and Italians and Spaniards to cooperate with each other. And now the Soviet Union is gone. And now we have other challenges to peace in Europe. And these other challenges to peace in Europe include nationalism and the rise of nationalism in the Balkans, among the Serbs, among the Croats, among the other groups, the Albanians concentrated here in Kosovo, as well as, of course, in this area here. And Tito, the great unifier, dictator, has long been dead. And these people, of course, as well, one of the main sources of unification, I'll make sure you can see this, one of the main sources of a creation of incentive for these people who traditionally often don't like each other to cooperate was also opposition to the Soviet Union, opposition to control from Moscow. Tito dies in 1980, the Soviet Union disintegrates in 1991. Why do we have to tolerate each other? Many people, not everybody, but many people are arguing here in Serbia, in Croatia, we don't like each other. We don't like having to be under each other's control. We have our disputes. Serbs have their disputes. Croats have their disputes. Everybody's got disputes over Bosnia and Herzegovina. You can't see, let me see if I scroll down here. Oh, there you see Tito, the communist insurgent leader who became ruler of Yugoslavia, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and died in 1980. And then you can see here a map of the breakup of Yugoslavia. I don't want to spend too much time here, these different countries, republics declaring independence, Serbs being unhappy as well about Yugoslavia because they claim that Tito drew these boundaries in Yugoslavia so that 30% of Serbs, almost 1/3 of the members of the Serbian nation, were put outside of Serbia in these boundaries that Tito created. It's not fair. 1/3 of the Serbian population here, they rebelled here in 1991. You can see there are Serbs here. This is Republika Srpska today, this dark blue here. Here, those were Croats that you can't see. They don't like being in Bosnia Herzegovina anyway. The point is, this Yugoslav Communist Republic, like the Soviet Union, was constituted by the communist leaders of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union to achieve different, numerous political objectives. But one of those objectives was to convince the smaller peoples in Yugoslavia and the smaller peoples in the Soviet Union that Yugoslavia is not really an unofficial version of the new Serbian Empire, because Serbs are half the population in Yugoslavia. And the Soviet Union is not really a new communist form of a Russian Empire. And so the point is, both and this is what Vladimir Putin just said, right? That under communism in the Soviet Union, the communists created the Soviet Union in a way to weaken the appearance of Russian power, because Russia was 1/2 of the population of the Soviet Union. And for Ukrainians and Georgians and Latvians and Estonians, they were always suspicious that, yeah, you're telling us this is not a new Russian empire, communist leaders, but really it still is, isn't it? It's just got a smiley face. It's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But still, if you're an ambitious Lithuanian or Georgian or Ukrainian and you want to rise to the top, highest levels in the Soviet Union, you better speak Russian. You better go to the best universities. And where are the best universities? They're in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Oh, and guess what? You're going to take your classes not in Georgian, not in Lithuanian, not in Ukrainian. You're going to take your classes in Russian. So the point is, pretty much most people were not happy with Yugoslavia, living in Yugoslavia, because Croats are going, this is really a Serb empire, isn't it? That you try to deceive us, you communists, making us believe or brainwashing us that, no, it's not a Serbian empire. And the Serbs are saying, it's not fair. Yugoslavia is really abusing the Serbs. And the Russians and the Soviet Union are saying the same thing. It's not fair. The Soviet Union, we're not allowed, for example, to have a Russian Communist Party. Russian Republic in the Soviet Union was not allowed to have a Russian Communist Party until 1990, right before it broke up. The Russian Republic, of the 15 republics in the Soviet Union, did not have its own Republic Division Security Service. The KGB, the Komitet Государственной Безопасности, the secret police. There wasn't a Russian compartment of this KGB. And this was all trying to convince the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians and the Georgians and the Latvians that this Soviet Union is not a new form of Russian empire. And it didn't convince them, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and Estonians, generally speaking, and it also irritated the Russians. And one of the tasks that was undertaken was to draw the boundaries of the republics of Yugoslavia and the republics of the Soviet Union in a way that would appear to give benefits to the non-Russians in the Soviet Union and the non-Serbs in Yugoslavia, and including drawing the boundaries in favorable ways for Ukrainian Republic, for example. This is what Putin said a few months ago in a speech. He's very open about this. The communists had their social engineering plans, and they drew these boundaries for their own objectives and aims, and they hurt us Russians. And for us Russians, we cannot accept that the cradle of Russian civilization is becoming, quote unquote, Europeanized by the beautiful attraction of the European Union. Join us, Ukraine, and become part of the nations of Europe, the family nations of Europe. You will become Ukrainians, and we will help build a Ukrainian nation state, and your people will become and feel more and more Ukrainian and European and pro-American. And Russia's going, under Moscow's government, under Putin, this is intolerable. You're going to cut out the cradle of our Russian identity, of who we are. Kyiv is where we became Russians. It's where we accepted Christianity. And you're going to make this into part of the American empire, the American unofficial empire, as represented by the soft power of the European Union. Unacceptable. And so to go back to the notes really emphasize 1993, the coming into force of the Treaty of Maastricht in launching the European Union, and the challenges that European integration has really faced in reaction to the end of the Cold War and the response to the failure to prevent outbreak of violence in the middle of Europe in Yugoslavia, to respond by more integration. We'd have to go in the thinking of European integration supporters. You can't stop integrating. If you stop, you're going to fall down. It's like riding a bicycle, right? If you stop pedaling on the bicycle, you're going to fall over. And Europe has a bad history, and let's not forget that that history can produce more violence today, as we're seeing right now in Ukraine. Putin is talking about that these people that dominate Ukrainian politics, they don't control all of it, but the dominant forces, they're Nazis. Why is he saying that they're German Nazis? Because he's referring to the militant Ukrainian nationalists that allied with the Germans when the Germans invaded, because the Germans were the enemy of Stalin. And they wanted to break away Ukraine from the Soviet Union. So the enemy of my enemy is my. So they talked and allied and worked with the Germans because they hated what Stalin did to them in the 1930s. In Putin's mindset, these are the people that align with the most horrible form of human behavior we've seen ever, the Nazis. And they're taking control over Ukraine because they are intensely motivated, because they're nationalists. And they're incredibly pro-West, pro-German. And now they control this government and they don't control it, but they dominate it because they're Ukrainian nationalists. They are really motivated, and they are the ones that will fight and kill and die for the independence of their nation, Ukraine. And we talked about this earlier. Nationalists, American nationalists, French nationalists, Chinese nationalists, Polish nationalists, Russian nationalists, German nationalists, they tend to stereotype. They see the world in simplified, grossly simplified images of challenges from outside actors. And they see those challenges in terms of stereotypical forms that you can predict the kind of stereotypes that they will perceive, and they'll really believe it. And thirdly, nationalists tend to overestimate their power capabilities. So apparently Putin and his Russian neo-authoritarian populists, let's use the term, authoritarian populist ruling clique, they like nationalists everywhere, they overestimated their power capability regarding Ukraine. They thought that they would win there and half the Ukrainian army would surrender. That the Ukrainians would really fight. It's so decadent and backward. These people would greet them as liberators. And oops, now they made a mistake. And it's not just them that did this, the Americans did it. Under Donald Trump, not Donald Trump, but under Donald Rumsfeld, when he was Secretary of Defense, we will invade Iraq and these people will greet us as liberators. We'll go into Afghanistan and we will enforce our will because we won the Cold War. We know what we're doing. Not unlike the Soviet Union when they were defeated there in the 1980s. You see these patterns among nationalists that emerge again and again and again. To me, it's just fascinating, as well as horrifying. But going back to the book is trying to explain how Europeanization has developed and evolved over the years, with the particular emphasis with the beginning of the European Union almost 30 years ago. Well, yeah, just about 30 years ago. And what has been the response of Europeanization within France to Europeanization, within Germany, within Poland, within Greece, within Bulgaria? Those are the case studies in the book. And again, I keep coming back to this unfortunate tendency that even though Europeanization is supposed to bring peace to Europe, the people that rule, the ruling groups in Moscow today, do not view the European Union as a force for peace. They see it, as I said before, that if this is NATO, the fist of NATO, this is the smiley face of the European Union. The European Union is the civilian and economic side of the same coin. NATO, European Union. And the European Union aims to, in the prevailing view in Moscow today, brainwash the people of Ukraine. You're not really Russians, you're really Ukrainians. And if you become Ukrainian, you become part of Europe. And that means Russia loses what it views as a critical part of its national patrimony. And in which the European Union may have desires and aims to be a civilian superpower, in a multipolar world, an actor separate from China and Russia. But the European Union does not demonstrate that it can be independent and autonomous from the United States. Sometimes different European leaders over the years and decades have made such statements. Francois Mitterrand, the socialist president of France, wrote privately that the Americans are a problem. And Charles de Gaulle had a problem with the Americans and the British. That's why he said the British shouldn't join. But when you look at what the European Union actually does, as we see right now, today, in a time of crisis, they realign and reform up behind American leadership. So, can that change at this critical time in world history, when we have two countries with thousands of nuclear warheads on the verge of direct military conflict over a country with 45 million people, also in the heart of Europe? Can the European Union develop the capacity to convince Moscow, and to some extent Beijing, that Europe really is not just the handmaiden, the servant of Washington, that the European Union can act autonomously and independently from Washington? I can't really answer, because I have my own wishful thinking, and but I can't allow my wishful thinking to shape my analysis. And I think it's unlikely. And so I think in the various scenarios that we're likely to see, the fighting will continue in Ukraine. It will continue for weeks. It will continue for months, like it did in Bosnia 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And there's going to be horrific violence. And we're more likely to see Ukraine be partitioned between the part that will be annexed by Russia and the Western part that will become a new independent country. I'm not certain that's going to happen, but every day that this violence continues, that scenario becomes more and more likely, because as more and more people die, horrible images, experiences, trauma become more and more pervasive. And then we see stereotyping and emotion become more and more dominant in policymaking. We see fear, hatred, and disgust come to dominate the actions of individuals and groups. And like we saw in Bosnia, the end result is maximalist zero-sum solutions of separation and forced population movements, exchanges. That's unfortunately more likely than not. Although the situation is changing almost hour by hour. There's talk now about the Russians and the Ukrainians meeting and negotiating and making, but again, this just reminds me of what I recall from when I was in Bulgaria 25 years ago. There were ceasefires declared in Bosnia, and then they were just discarded. Leaders can make declarations of ceasefires, but the troops on the ground, you lose control over them. They're doing what they do to try to survive, and the fog of war, the chaos, it's just like, it's deja vu all over again from when I was in Bulgaria in the 1990s, when I first arrived in 1994. Except Ukraine's 10 times bigger. And so this is about Europeanization. But we need to talk about what Europeanization has done in terms of the member states and its impact. It is, I guess, somewhat of an achievement that Germans and French, despite 1,000 years of preparing for war, fighting war, and recovering from war, are now the driving engine of European integration. The French-German relationship has always been characterized as the core relationship that is driving and promoting the integration of Europe. And okay, so Europeanization is a process that's both top down and bottom up. Bottom up is one way by which to view Europeanization's impact, in which the different groups and constituencies within the European member states, including business groups, as well as others like students, are really driving and pushing for European integration because they see more opportunities to make more profit. If we more closely align our national economies in the European Union, the obstructions and barriers to efficiency will be reduced. And so that's a force driving Europeanization. Then there's top-down Europeanization, in which that is where you see the impact of the international political system, that we as the leaders of Europe have to respond to the violent breakup of Yugoslavia and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. We have to act, and that is also very critically important for explaining European integration. One important point that is, can you see that? Make sure that's repeatedly made in discussing the European Union is that the European Union is an elite-driven project. The European Union is a project that's driven by the ruling classes in Europe that are committed to making this happen. Not all of them, but the ones that have dominated European politics since the end of World War II have been committed to making European integration happen because of the experience of what happened in the 1940s and in World War I earlier. Right, that we have to cooperate if we're going to try to prevent the conditions in which horrible creatures like Adolf Hitler can come to power. We cannot allow conditions to emerge ever again in any German power, in any German state, where some horrible creature like Adolf Hitler can succeed in becoming leader of the country. That means we have to cooperate. We have to make sure that we have general European prosperity. That means we cannot engage in policies that are ultra competitive in terms of viewing that your gain is my loss and my gain is your loss. No zero-sum thinking. We have to cooperate and coordinate and collaborate in order to maintain relative prosperity and political security and stability in Europe, because Hitler came to power because of radical insecurity, radical economic dislocation, created conditions for this horrible thing, Adolf Hitler, to come to power. And those people are everywhere. They're in Germany, they're in the United States, they're in Russia, they're in China, they're in France, and they must stay on the margins, politically marginalized. And again, people can say never again. We will never see a German-type regime emerge, but we're seeing one now emerge in Russia, and we had one. We're moving in that direction under Donald Trump. Donald Trump was a fascist. He was an authoritarian populist. He just didn't have as much support, intense support among the Americans as Putin does among the Russians. Why? Because of a different context. But Donald Trump believed the most crazy things too. Yes, he really believes Barack Obama was not born in the United States. Yes, he really believes that he won the election in 2020. It was stolen from him. He believes that. The way Putin believes that the Nazis are ruling Ukraine. It's crazy, but nationalists go crazy. Question is, how much support and how intense is that support within Russia, within America, within whatever country, whatever time frame we're talking about? And you know, Germany in the 1930s was a different place, obviously, than Germany today. In the 1930s, the Germans had lost World War I. There were millions of war veterans from that war who had lost so much, including their health, their legs, their limbs. You could see German war veterans begging on the streets, having lost a leg or an arm or a face. They lost 30% of their territory after World War I. Then there was the great inflation that happened in the 1920s that destroyed everybody's savings. Their money became useless. You know, you're supposed to save your money and invest so you can retire. All that money became gone. And then the Great Depression happened. And so many Germans, with their dreams and hopes and aspirations, just destroyed, transferred their belief in a better world to Adolf Hitler. Donald Trump didn't have that condition in the United States. He didn't function in that type of political environment. Putin is increasingly functioning more in that kind of political environment. My concern is in Russia. These economic sanctions that the Europeans and the Americans have put on Russia, they're going to devastate the Russian middle class. The Russian middle class that has emerged over the last 30, 40 years is going to disappear. Either they're going to become immiserated or they're leaving. Russians are leaving Russia now. The people with money who can get out are getting out. So back to Europeanization. They say convergence can be a consequence of Europeanization, but it must not be equated with Europeanization. They're saying convergence is the consequence of Europeanization. But what are the processes? Convergence means countries harmonizing their social welfare policies or their taxation policies, or even borrowing best practice. But why is that happening? That's a consequence of Europeanization. What are the processes that bring about Europeanization? And that's what they want to focus on in terms of how countries of the European Union or want to join the European Union, quote unquote, Europeanize. What does that mean? What are the processes that bring that about? Convergence can be a consequence of, well, I already mentioned, international policies and standards, including common positions of the member states regarding, for example, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, or today in 2022 towards Moscow. Similar parallel problems, complying with international rules, including trade rules. I mean, that was a belief, right? That if Europe is going to be prosperous and stable, that Europeans would be better served by creating a common single market and customs union, and Europe would negotiate with big America and emerging Japan in coming up with common international trade policies, right? And incentives, that is also part of incentives with global markets, and also with the transnational communication, particularly with the rise of technology, again, encouraging countries to converge, while the processes by which that convergence happens is understood by, for example, how do lobby groups, business lobby groups in Europe, lobby European Union institutions in Germany versus Italy versus France? I mean, still, most French economic activity is concentrated in France. Even Germany, right? They're heavily committed to exports and imports. 1/3 of their economy depends upon exports and imports in Germany, but 2/3 is still domestic. So how do German business groups and companies come together to lobby and view the European Union integration in terms of affecting the German way of integrating or interacting with the German government, but this time within a German government that emerged after World War II, embedded in this new European system that was started pretty much at the same time as Germany was being reconstituted after having been conquered and occupied at the end of World War II. Versus France, which of course was not integrated in Europe in that way. It was integrated a different way because French, different circumstances, French, different history. And how do French businesses and lobby groups and trade unions representing labor? And what about the legal traditions and the legal systems in France and Germany and Italy? How do the attorneys, the lawyers view European integration? How do they view the courts? When the lawyers and attorneys and the law professors in Germany and Italy, they're teaching their students about law, how do they interpret what the European Court of Justice, which is the top legal authority in the European Union, how do they interpret what that court decides in terms of what it means to teach you? You're from Switzerland? Okay, you're not in the European Union. You're from US? Okay. Well, we have some students from Italy and Spain. How do those Spanish law professors teach their students in Spain or in Italy about what the European Union law means for Spanish legal system and Spanish attorneys and Spanish law? And that's a theme that emerges when you read the whole book. They conclude, give you a foresight of what they conclude in the end of the book, is that Europeanization is not eliminating differences among European countries. European countries have their own historical traditions. They're being directly impacted by Europeanization, but they're continuing to evolve and develop in their own unique national trajectories, national tendencies. And Europeanization, in terms of what it means for the interaction of these countries, is this commitment to cooperation, right? But still, when the European countries, the European Union member states agree on a policy or adopt a law in Brussels, they leave it to the Germans to implement it in the German way in Germany, and they leave it to the French to implement it in the French way in France, and they leave it to the Italians to implement it in the Italian way in Italy. And when they come together at the top levels to negotiate and interact with each other, they emphasize consensus, right? That we all have to reach agreement, not force anybody to do something that they view as unacceptable. And you do whatever is necessary to make them view it as acceptable, including giving them some other benefits on another issue, so they'll compromise on this other issue. Convergence may be occurring because of other factors like the relationship with the United States, but it may not be a result of Europeanization. Convergence may also be a result of the rise of China, but we want to understand Europeanization. We have to define Europeanization in terms of an explicit understanding that what we are doing is an obligation or is phrased and explained in terms of our European obligations. When you look at how they Europeanize in Spain, and that means the way Spanish leaders and authorities talk to Spanish people will be different than the way Italian authorities and leaders talk to Italian people. Because you have to articulate and interpret the obligations to the European Union in a way that win political elections in Italy and in France and in Spain. Your harmonization is not an order or directive guided by the European Union. How the member states of the European Union implement their obligations to the European Union is a process which is still driven by the unique histories and trajectories and interests and groups in each of the member states. So there may be important motives to harmonize policies, whether it be taxation or welfare policies or taxation policies, but these motivations about for carrying out this harmonization may come from the European Union, but the domestic factors are still going to be the determining factor in shaping the output of what it means for the French to implement their European obligations versus the Italians versus the Spaniards and so on. But responding to these challenges, like the rise of China or the war in Ukraine, may encourage harmonization, but it may also increase the role of the European Union. As I already mentioned, this development was called PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation. In other words, the creation of the European Union military infrastructure would be an example of Europeanization that reflects this drive for harmonization, because we've all got a big problem, and this problem is Russia, and we have to respond. So Europeanization is about political integration on the domestic level of the member states. So, you know, in terms of political parties learning and borrowing from each other, reacting to each other, including Eurosceptic parties, even parties that don't like European integration, in a sense, practice some political integration because they see how Marine Le Pen in France and the National Rally Party can give us in Poland on the right, the Law and Justice Party, both insights and arguments to make how our demands are good too in Poland, because we see how the right-wing parties act in France and Italy. And it also impacts the institutional dynamics. Like, for example, that's a focus in the book, how the member states create special government departments or change the administrative structure of the European Union-oriented ministries. In Spain, that's a big focus in Spain, how Spain did this, then this, in terms of reorganizing the executive branch of the Spanish government, the Prime Minister's office, and the ministries responsible for European integration. I mean, that's one really concrete way by which to study Europeanization. What is this thing called Europeanization? Oh, you want to know? Okay, well, look at how Spain or Italy or France, how they have adopted and changed their own formal administrative flowchart about how they structure and govern themselves in terms of explicit reorganization, written down and creation of different offices and bodies that are responsible for Europeanization of the Spanish laws in Spain, for example. And this Europeanization has consolidated and spread to other fields. Keep this in mind also, is another important point here, that there really wasn't much of a master plan about how to bring about Europeanization. I mean, just think about it. World War I happens, tremendous catastrophe, a whole generation of young people, mostly men, dead. Never again, never again. And then it happens again in World War II. And now we have nuclear weapons. And if there's World War III, there will be no more Europe. So the leaders of post-war Western Europe, Stalin has his solutions. You want to solve the problem of nationalism and war in Europe? I know what to do. Joseph Stalin. And he implements his plan and his leadership in Eastern Europe and at horrible costs. The West Europeans say, well, what are we going to do to prevent these wars from happening? And the beginning of European integration, again, it was just in the news yesterday, was not economically focused. You mentioned the Treaty of Paris and the Coal and Steel Committee. The first international treaty organization for European affairs was the Council of Europe. It was a human rights organization. That we need to work together in Europe to try to protect human rights. And the Council of Europe was created in 1948, 4 years before the Treaty of Paris. And it's much bigger than the European Union. It includes former communist countries, including, well, it did include Russia, but Russia 2 days ago left the Council of Europe because it was going to be expelled by the other members because of its behavior in Ukraine. But in 1948, they thought, well, we'll try to integrate our policies regarding the protection of the human rights of our people, because the Nazis were all about violence and oppression and abuse of the human rights of despised groups of people. So we will oppose that and try to prevent that from ever happening again. And the result was nothing, or very little, because it was too sensitive. Just 5 years, 3 years after the World War II, Germans and Italians and French are going to look at each other's country. Hey, you know, France, we don't think you treat your Italian like we're. What? Well, you can go jump in a lake. You gave us Mussolini, Italy. You're going to tell us about human rights? It became too emotional, too sensitive. And that was important, but that was considered to be too slow. And it was too slow as a solution or an answer to the problem of nationalism in Europe, because it was dealing with issues that were too politically sensitive. So the European Union then moved off to business, coal and steel, as the beginning industries to try to integrate, to encourage collaboration, cooperation, coordination, and communication among Italy, Western Germany, because Eastern Germany is under communist occupation, and France, along with Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, the original 6 countries. And the European Union leadership was really excited about the European Coal and Steel Community, and they focused on coal and steel industries for integration, because they thought, well, you can't make a modern army unless you have steel and coal. You can't have a big war machine unless you have steel and fuel. Just like we saw in World War II, right? So we'll try to bring peace to Europe by integrating the foundational industries for a mid-20th century war machine. And it seemed to be relatively successful in terms of striving towards the objectives of the German steel and coal industry, cooperating and collaborating with the government of Germany, the government of France, and the French coal and steel industry, the Italian coal and steel industry, cooperating with the governments of the 6 member states of the coal and steel community to increase efficiency, reduce wasteful competition, open up their societies and their economies to inspection and observation by each other, so there'd be less likelihood for suspicion and paranoia, because we are more transparent to each other. We can see what's going on, or believe at least we can see what's going on in each other's countries. The Americans are also saying, hey, you Europeans, we want you to cooperate with each other because we are going to give you economic aid to recover from World War II and the devastation, because we want you to be strong and stable against the threat of communism and the Soviet Union. But you guys, you've got to cooperate with each other. No more wasteful competition on the defense of national interest as a justification. We, Germany or Italy or France, we have to have our own coal and steel industry, completely independent of France's coal and steel industry, because we might need to war with France. So we got to have our own coal and steel industry so that we can prepare for war. No more of that. You've got to integrate your economies and become more efficient and more prosperous. And if you do, we'll give you loans and grants in the European Recovery Program, also called the Marshall Plan. Right? And so, and they implement the European Coal and Steel Community, and the leaders of Europe, they get all excited. This is good, this is a good idea. You know what we should do now? Let's integrate our militaries. And what do you think the response was? Well, let me just go to the Wikipedia entry here. So you can see, you know, a lot of different actors spend a lot of resources on making the Wikipedia entries desirable or favorable to them. So here, as you can see, the entry for the European Coal and Steel Community. And you can see Algeria used to be part of it because it was a colony of France at the time. And the Schuman Declaration. And this, I said, was signed in 1950, was signed in 51 and came into force in 52. The Treaty of Paris, right? So what about going one step further and creating the European Defense Community? I'm not going to find it here. But treaty establishing the European Defense Community. And this was it was signed just a year later, 1952, by the leaders of this European integration effort, Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman. And guess what happened? They then took this plan, initiated by the French Prime Minister Pleven and the Pleven Plan, to the French Parliament, and they said, "Are you crazy? You're going to integrate the French army with the West German army? Just 5 years after World War II, after what the German army did to us? No!" And that's a theme in European integration, right? You have these leaders talking to each other. Yeah, now we've done the European Coal and Steel Community. Let's move forward in the European Defense Community. Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do it. Yeah, we'll do this. Yeah. And then these leadership cliques come up with these ideas and they take them out to the public. And the mass public says, "What? You're going to integrate the French army with the German army?" No, you're not. Or we're going to create in 2004 a constitution for the European Union. So the leaders of the European Union 16 years ago came up with a draft treaty, constitution treaty for the European Union. Sounds great, right? We have a European Union. Now we should have a constitution where the American states formed the United States of America, and they wrote a constitution. And let's do this. And then the French voters said, "No, you're not going to integrate France in the United States of Europe, or you don't call it the United States of Europe, but you're not going to create a European Union with a constitution that undermines or threatens French sovereignty, the sovereignty of the French nation." They voted it down in a referendum, and the Dutch did as well. So the point I want to emphasize is this process of European integration, there's not some overarching master plan from start to finish to make this happen. It's just this belief that it started with this belief, we've got to do something to make sure that we continue to cooperate with each other instead of focusing upon suspicion, fear, and preparing for the worst outcome, and thereby through our competition and preparing for the worst, make the worst happen. We've got to establish institutional mechanisms where we maintain communication, collaboration, cooperation, and coordination, the 4 C's. We tried to do it in human rights. That didn't go so well because it's too sensitive. But let's focus on business. Who doesn't want more business? You want more money, you want more money, I want more money, right? So we can convince more people that integrating our economic interests and focusing on coal and steel and then integrating other areas, that's a good idea. And particularly since we got the Americans behind us, supporting us, because the Americans are concerned about the Soviet Union and communism. And we have to rebuild and restructure from the devastation of the war. And that will be our focus. But then, as I said, the Soviet Union finally disappeared 30 years ago. And the European Union has been adapting ever since. But you saw British nationalism emerged and took Britain out of the European Union. So let me go back to the notes. And I guess I keep coming back to what's going on in Europe today, because in a lot of ways, you know, this is potentially, well, it is a great tragedy that this peace plan for Europe apparently is founded not intentionally, but structurally on restricting influence of Russia. And that goes back to its Cold War roots. And those interests, both in Washington and in Europe, are really important for explaining the behavior of Europe to post-communist Moscow. And, but still, we have to learn from what we have achieved. I mean, nothing is perfect in this world. And maybe, hopefully, we can come up with a peace plan for Ukraine that will, this is what I've been thinking about, come up with an international oversight structure involving European Union and Russia, maybe through the United Nations Security Council, bring in Russia and China, to restructure the constitution of Ukraine, in which Russia and Europe, as well as the United States and China, will play an equal role and in terms of equal voice in overseeing the reconstruction of the damage in Ukraine, changing the constitution, the political constitution of Ukraine, so that Ukraine will recognize Crimea is no longer part of Russia, no longer part of Ukraine. But to do that would require that the European Union also reach a trade agreement, an economic agreement with Russia. And I think that that has to be part of a peace plan for Ukraine. Is it likely? As I said, every day that passes becomes less likely. Instead, as every day that passes with this war going on, that it's going to result in basically the de facto partition of Ukraine, with Moscow annexing much of the east and the west becoming a new state in Europe. And that's if we don't accidentally fall into a nuclear war. I mean, as I said, there's over 3 million refugees have fled Ukraine. That's a lot, but that country's 45 million people. So, okay, so I promised myself I wouldn't talk so much, but it's like the professors that write the book in European integration that we're using for this course, the people that study European Union integration, they tend to be strong supporters of Europeanization in the European Union. Why? Because they really want it to work. They want the European Union to be successful. They want it to bring peace and stability and prosperity to Europe. They really want it to work. I mean, that's why people go into European Union studies, because for a number of reasons, but one important reason is because they want to make a contribution to making this peace plan effective. And what I'm describing, from my point of view, is that the European Union has inadvertently contributed to this crisis going on today in Ukraine. The biggest war in Europe since World War II. And we're at a critical time right now. But we still need to study the impact of Europeanization on the countries that are in the European Union, because we need to know what this is going on here if we're going to learn from the past, to learn useful lessons and avoid future mistakes. So typically in studying Europeanization, focusing on policy domains, coal and steel, or services, or communications, or different policy domains, it is the dimension of Europeanization that is most empirically investigated. What has been the impact of European Union on trade policies of the member states, for example? The focus is on policies emanating from the EU impact on the member state policies, and how the European institutions have played a role in shaping the behavior of how the German government and the French government act in this European multi-level political system, in which you have national and European Union level institutional actors, and with the European Union institutions getting more competences. Competences refers to legal responsibilities. So the European Union, most starkly illustrated by the emergence of the euro, the money, one single currency that 19 of the 27 member states have adopted. So 8 have not adopted it. Some will, like Croatia probably will adopt it maybe this year. And they'll become the 20th member state. And the European Central Bank getting more and more authority and control over more and more of the elements of the national banking systems in France and Germany and Italy, for example. That is a major focus of Europeanization. Europeanization has affected virtually all domestic policy areas since the late 1980s, not coincidentally when the Cold War is falling apart, when the Cold War is ending. And so the policies where the European Union has had the biggest impact on a policy domain is where we see the biggest constraints and opportunities historically that have emerged in regard to domestic policy settings for shaping that have been most impacted by European Union. So where there was greatest opportunity to make an impact, that's where European Union policy has most developed. Like I said, they focused first on European integration on human rights. That was too sensitive. They had much more likelihood of making an impact by integrating business, coal and steel, and then moving on from coal and steel. Because there's less obstacles. We all want more money. We all want more wealth, right? At the domestic level, differential adaptation emerges in response to different domestic pressures. So, some European countries have stronger trade union movements than others. So that will make an impact in terms of how those countries respectively carry out their European obligations to each other. The more binding the European Union policies are, the European Union will support those more binding policies, directives, and regulations. So if there's a commitment of the member states of the European Union that we're going to integrate our trade policies or our aviation air travel policies, then they will give the European Union institutions more formal authority to issue what are called directives and regulations. Those are official terms. in the European Union, and those come out of the European Union policymaking process. Other areas that are more dual competency, that we let the nation states have a primary role as well as European impact, then there tends to be more informal methods of coordination, like sharing best practice. The European Union issues, I think, thousands of directives and regulations every year. Creating a single market, that has been a multi-decade project that you can just imagine. You know, how do you regulate and harmonize and negotiate compromises among the Germans and the French and the Italians and Spaniards and all the countries in terms of coming up with one set of general regulations and rules for regulating different aspects of agriculture or manufacturing. It's hard to create a single market. You want to create a single market, you need a strong, effective governing authority. And why do I say that? Because, you know, maybe for Europeans, well, yeah, sure, but Americans, correct me if I'm wrong, what's your name? Hello. Correct me if you disagree, but it seems to me that we Americans, we tend to think that the free market is a natural thing. It emerges naturally on its own. And big government is bad. Big government is something you want to avoid. You have a government because you need a government because you have criminals, so you need police, you need courts, you need jails, but economy and economic business is natural and emerges naturally. Of course, you can have corrupt people, you can have corrupt politicians and corrupt government administrators, and that's the problem. And government is almost a necessary evil. But that's not the way Europeans think. Europeans have always accepted, like here in South Korea and in Japan and China, that the state, through its effective regulation of society, makes, I almost said makes the market. It creates the economy. You have to have a strong state to have an effective market economy. And so, so the European Union, reflecting the fact that most of the member states are part of Europe, obviously, all of them are part of Europe, they will tend to have a stronger state focus. And so a lot of people, particularly in the United States, are suspect of the European Union because they think it's too state-oriented. So we already mentioned the open method of coordination and as a more informal process for coordinating and cooperating, collaborating, and communicating regarding policies that produce harmonization and maybe even convergence. And this is increasingly being used, for example, in foreign policy domains. Because this is typically, these are sensitive, politically very sensitive topics. We're talking about war and peace, or even employment policy. Like, how do you treat your workers? Should we have a European Union impose a European Union policy on how Germans and French and Italians should all treat their workers, the rights of workers to unionize, the rights of workers to go on strike, the kind of benefits that unemployed workers receive? These are very sensitive topics. And so the European Union will tend to avoid coming up with European Union formal directives and regulations on those issues. Although they have a functional tendency to move in that direction because it's unavoidable. If you're going to have the four freedoms, free movement of goods, services, capital, and people or labor in the single market of the European Union, then sooner or later, you're going to have to talk about, well, if we're going to encourage movement of labor across borders in Europe, then we have to come up with some way by which somebody, if they grow up and work in France for 20 years, they pay into a pension system, then they go to Italy and get a job there. So when they work in Italy, what about this French pension? Is that Italian pension system, how is it going to coordinate with the French pension system? The French pension system says you can retire when you're 60. The Italian system says you can retire when you're 62. So we have to talk about our pension systems if we're the leaders of Germany and France and Italy. And that's called neo-functional spillover. That as certain areas focus on achieve integration, you experience more and more economic and political pressure to expand your harmonization into related policy areas. Yeah, so the neo-functionalist approach to the study of European integration focused on interest groups. And not coincidentally, but primarily business interest groups. By promoting new opportunity structures at both the European Union and the national level, Europeanization has strongly affected economic interest groups. But again, let's not overemphasize European Union in the minds and thinking of most people in Europe. You in this class and me, we're highly unusual people. Most people in Switzerland, probably don't spend much time at all thinking about the European Union. Or in France. But again, these groups that do at the elite level come up with plans and make pressures and lobby for what their interests. But that's one of the reasons you see the European Union emphasizing less and less elections in determining policies, is because the mass of the population is more skeptical of Europeanization than people like you and me. I mean, think about it. You're taking this class in English. You speak multiple foreign languages. You're studying in South Korea. You didn't have to study in South Korea. You're globalizers. Europeanization, that's the European version of globalization. Whoa! We like that. But I don't know where you're from, Ella, but I'm from Ohio. And there's a lot more fear and suspicion about different types of people where I'm from in Ohio. I mean, most of my family voted for Trump. I know they voted for Trump in 2016, 2020. In Ohio, Trump won by big majorities in both elections. So, and so every once in a while, we experience this cold realization that our big Europeanization integration plans, that the mass of the population is not necessarily as excited about them as we are. Business interests are more prone to adopt strategies that align with EU political institutions and lobbying in regarding to EU directives. Yeah. Civil society interests like human rights groups, they do focus more they focus on European Union, but they're more focused on what's going on inside of their respective countries. Like if you're LGBTQ oriented, rights oriented, you're probably going to be more focused on how you live your life as an Italian, because even if you think about Europe, 99% of your time is spent living and swimming in the Italian Ocean, as a fish in the Italian Ocean. So your focus on your political activism is going to be focused on changing Italian laws. And European Union can be useful in trying to mobilize pressure on Italian politicians to shape Italian law, for example. So we see more anti-European parties emerging again since the Maastricht Treaty. And now with the new Cold War that might become hot between Russia and the West, will we see more European solidarity? That's always a danger. One way by which to make ourselves like each other is to come up with a scapegoat that we both hate. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's an unfortunate but natural human tendency. So, I mean, I was just listening yesterday to some professor on Zoom. There was a 24-hour marathon Ukraine politics marathon on Zoom. 24 hours, 24 panels with 3 or 4 professors for 24 hours. And one of these professors said, we owe gratitude to the Ukrainians, because as a result of the conflict of in Ukraine, we Europeans and Westerners, we have rediscovered the West. We have rediscovered the value of democracy. We've become more self-confident advocating for democracy. We've become more organized and more focused because the European Union and the United States moved so quickly to put sanctions on Russia. That's what he said, one of these professors. So I guess we're running out of time. So let me go to an exercise and go to a vote. And so let me see what I've got set up here in the few minutes remaining. You know, one of the nice things about using my computer is that I don't have to convert on that computer and end the class 20 minutes early on Zoom because I'm just using my own laptop now. But go to European Politics and Society. So what do I have? Oh, we got to do our debate. So to South Koreans, Brexit shows that Europeanization is overrated. So I'm going to go back to Zoom, forming into breakout rooms. We'll form in the time remaining. Assign, let you choose because I can't remember. Let's see. We'll create 2 groups. I will assign manually, create, rename pro, and rename con. And I think on con we had Gloria, Anais, and Ella. Are you con or pro? Okay. Oh, great. And in pro, we will assign Ella and Sarah. Okay. Open all rooms. So please join your 2 rooms. Join the room that you belong to, pro or con, on the debate topic on the basis of your paragraph. That's how I'm assigning you. So please join. Oh, you already joined. Who's going to speak first? Heads is the first person. Tails is the second person. And it is tails. So that means Sarah will speak for pro and Gloria will speak for con. Sarah Maria, are you pro? Where is she? Sarah. Well, she seems to have disappeared. Okay, well, Ella, you'll speak first for pro. Okay, and so if you need to communicate with her, Gloria can speak with Anais. You're Anais, aren't you? Oh, okay. So Gloria, speak with Anais, and we'll have 60 seconds before we go to our debate.
It seems like Gloria is pro too.
Oh, Gloria's pro too.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, I already wait. I have to wait for the room to close before I can move Gloria to pro.
Oh, that's supposed to be.
No, you're pro.
Okay.
But Maria, I don't know what happened with Maria.
Maybe the Wi-Fi went out. Wi-Fi's been weird.
I moved to pro. Okay.
The Wi-Fi is very bad in the rooms.
Oh, it is.
So I think that probably Sarah have some
Okay, well, maybe she'll come back.
issues.
Okay, so Ella, pro goes.
And I have to.
Ella, make your pro statement, please.
Okay, so, oh, should I put my mic on?
Yeah, please turn on your mic.
Oh, sorry. All right, so I think that, yes, Brexit shows to South Koreans that Europeanization is overrated because the reason that Brexit is detrimental to Europeanization because it shows that Europeans have their own differences and their own strong national identities, and they always don't get along even with Europeanization, and they have like their own views on things, which is good and bad. So the appeal of the EU is not appealing to sometimes to the members who have joined, which puts like a dampener on the view of Europeanization, because Europeanization definition is the impact of joining the EU and its effects on member states and its near neighbors. So Europeanization is a complex idea. It means different things to different people, but I think that South Koreans do not see Europeanization favorably because of disasters like Brexit and because of its lack of appeal.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, yeah, Brexit's a pretty strong example of something. Its significance is not clear. So, Anais, you are Khan and you appear to be by yourself, so you can make your response to Ella.
Yes. So while I understand that people can think it's Europeanization is overrated because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution as seen in the book, I think the European Union is needed. Well, I'm thinking in my country, Switzerland, for example, we are not in the European Union, but for a long time we have been making a lot of agreements with the European Union. So it shows that European Union has some power over the Europe and that it is needed. And yeah, Europeanization does not mean that it suppresses national interest, as the countries can protect their own domestic policies. So yeah, I'm gone.
Okay. And Gloria, make your pro statement, and you can respond to Anais as well, and Ella's
Okay.
also.
So as we saw many times in the methodological classes, a lot of member states started to adopt policies that were against the liberal and democratic political views of the European Union. We could just cite Poland with its law against abortion and homosexual people protection, Italy, which some part of the population organized fascist and not so secret meetings, but also its previous law allowing men to eat their too passionate women, only if it isn't done regularly. So European Union is supposed to unify countries and help them organize their policies in a progressist and liberal way. It should not accept countries whose leaders are problematic, whose citizens are expressively racist, and so on. Countries should deserve to be part of the EU. Belgium has a lot of work to do on its historical and colonialist background too. They are still denying part of Congo legacy and Congo past wounds. Precisely, the Brexit is a proof that the essence, the institutionalization of formal and informal rules, procedures, policy paradigms, styles, way of doing things, and shared belief and norm, which are first defined and consolidated in the making of EU decision, and then incorporated in the logic of domestic discourse, identities, political structures, and public policies of the European Union is failing apart. In my opinion, if they don't fit and don't want to evolve, they can go. Member states started a dangerous game pretending they were not aware of EU policies beforehand and then making referenda to gain people's trust about extremist and nationalist rising feeling. They all knew what being part of EU was about. Moreover, member states communicate with their own countries in a vertical manner, but the horizontal sharing communicative experience with and through the Euro processes are made to ensure the good fit of these member states. Nevertheless, as Europeanization is also about integrating domestic level and dynamics in the political process, Brexit shows that Europeanization limits and questions the European Union as a political entity.
Okay, that's a very sophisticated statement. So we're almost out of time here. So I'm going to just ask everybody to vote. And again, it's anonymous, so I don't know how you're voting, oh no, it's not anonymous, it's identified. So please vote as to your view as to whether or not Brexit shows that Europeanization is overrated. So we've got 4 people have voted so far. And I guess that will be it for today. And Yeah, yeah. I mean, time flies. It just seems I can't avoid talking about the Ukraine war. The biggest war in Europe since World War II, and it's just beginning. In discussing Europeanization. But I'll try to focus more on the notes in future weeks. When they were speaking, could you hear them on your speakers? Only through my computer? Could you hear what Gloria was saying?
Oh, my computer was, the volume was off, so.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm just curious if that was something limited here. So, okay, well, that's it for today. And I'm going to move down. I think they want me out of this room because there's another class here. So